But Martin, let's start with Donald Trump announcing this national security strategy. This is pretty much a year since he was elected, and I think a lot of thought has been going into this. The biggest change for me was the attitude to China seems to be changing.
Well, not really. I mean, it's a reassertion of what the Americans have been saying all along.
Hang on. Okay, so let me just explain what I mean by that, because the focus has been on North Korea, and Trump has been saying, well, China, we can do deals with these guys, we can get along with them, so long as they put pressure on the North Koreans. And now it seems he's saying, well, actually, we're not, it doesn't look like they are, and so they're not playing ball, they're not playing the game, so we're going to actually start criticising them much more.
Well, I think the national security strategy was written by the generals who run the United States of America. It wasn't written by Trump anyway.
Sorry, President is in charge, not the generals.
No, I'm afraid he isn't. The foreign policy of the United States has now been decided by a triumvirate of generals. And they're the ones who
are they?
McMaster, Kelly, I can't remember the names now, but the point is that they've been... this is one of the most militarist...
Are these in the cabinet? We're talking about what? Where about the National Security
I do
Council
not believe that Donald Trump wrote... Donald Trump basically promised various things in his election campaign, and what's actually happened is some things he has done and some things he hasn't done. And the things that he's done are the things that the deep state wants him to do, and the things he hasn't done, like building relations with Russia, he hasn't been able to do. Although, incidentally, on that very topic, there is this week something that's happened that's quite interesting, which is that the CIA tips off the Russians about an ISIS attack in St. Petersburg, in Kazan Cathedral, which then allowed the police in St. Petersburg to arrest the people concerned.
Well, that's great, surely. It's fantastic.
Well, it is, but it's hard to know what's exactly going on there. And but nevertheless, that's...
No, you're going to tell me, aren't you, that the CIA were behind it in the first place?
Well, I said, you do have to ask the question: how did they know about all this stuff? Huh? The Russians didn't know anything about it, and they were tipped off, and then they managed to arrest the people. And the whole thing, it's all smoke and mirrors. But the point is, the national security strategy, the key to it, is saying that basically China and Russia are regarded as enemies. Now, we've known that forever. I mean, it's not as if this is new. I mean, everybody openly discusses China and Russia as enemies. But you can see that the Chinese and the Russian response to that is, well, we don't regard you as our enemy. We're rather disappointed that you're taking that sort of attitude. This is the 21st century. It's about time, China owns US national debt. Russia is a more functioning democracy today than the United States. I stand by that if anybody argues with me. I think the United States is no longer a functional democracy. Just a simple point: Trump didn't win the majority of the votes, and that's because the American system's based like that. When Putin stands in March, he's probably likely to get 60% of the vote straight out.
Well, I think that's rather a cheap way of talking about the election of the president, because anyone that wants to get elected has to look at the system first and say, how am I going to get elected using this system? Much more important, surely, is the amount of money which big companies and banks pay to particular candidates to win.
There's enormous numbers of questions about the US electoral system, but when you are fighting World War III, which is what we're talking about here, there's a question of legitimacy. Who's giving the orders and what's their mandate? And the fact of the matter is that President Putin will have a stronger mandate than anybody elected to run the United States of America, and it's going to be Donald Trump for the near future, who's got half the population despise him, and he's got real problems inside the infrastructure. But of course he's just doing what he's told, because that's the way the United States works. Now, there's further sanctions been put on Russia today in relation to the so-called Magnitsky sanctions, Magnitsky Act in the US. I mean, basically...
What's that about, then?
Oh, it's about this guy called Magnitsky who died in custody in Russia, and it's been ballooned into this huge, Russia's a terrible place, we've got to have sanctions on them. Basically, the Russians are now pretty much resigned to the fact that there's going to be permanent sanctions on them, and therefore they are going to reciprocate by having sanctions on the US. But of course, this is not... Even if the sanctions on Russia were to succeed, Russia is in fact the 8th biggest economy in the world, I think, and if the Russian economy was pushed to its knees as a result of sanctions, it would immediately pull down various other economies. Say the Polish economy would be affected, the Baltic states would be affected. All of this idea, don't forget, sanctions are basically an act of war, and as our glorious new defence secretary suggested the other day, we're already at war with Russia.
Did he say?
He did. He said that we're at war with Russia, and of course we've had Boris Johnson in Russia this week saying that cyber fixing of elections by the Russians is definitely going on. It's going on in America. It's going on in Europe, but it's not going on in Britain because, of course, the allegation is that they fixed the Brexit vote, which, of course, Johnson was very much in favour of, so therefore they haven't done anything in Britain, even though this is the sort of thing that was being suggested.
But Martin,
by Theresa
Boris
May.
Johnson is over there because he says that he wants better relations between Britain and Russia.
Well, don't forget that the Russians are willing to meet with him at any time and always have been, and it's him that didn't turn up for various reasons on various other occasions when he was supposed to turn up. But you can see that Lavrov's response to the allegations that the Russians are aggressively interfering in the outside world and trying to steer it in a direction they want is saying, well, it's just insulting. We're going out of our way to meet with you. We could have just said, you can't come here, Johnson. Twice you've been invited here and you've not turned up. This time you want to come, maybe you shouldn't come. But they don't take that view. They always talk to everybody.
But someone has got to confront Moscow over meddling in Brexit, surely. And Boris is the main man.
Well, no, but Boris is suggesting that they didn't meddle in Brexit because, of course, he was in pro-Brexit. So the idea that the Russians... I mean, Paul Mason in The Guardian came out with ridiculous stuff about how the Russians fixed the Brexit vote. And there is a certain...
There is evidence, surely, that they use social media.
There is evidence that social media were used by Cambridge Analytica, who were funded by US oligarchs and billionaires, yes. But it wasn't the Russians. There's virtually zero evidence. Even the reports that they're quoting say that there was less than 0.1% supposedly Russian sourced impact on social media. It's basically saying anybody in Russia can't comment on anything because it's interference in other people's elections. It's absurd and it's ridiculous. And of course, it's very interesting that in the case of Brexit, both May and Johnson have suggested that there was no Russian interference because, of course, that would suggest that the result was wrong.
Hang on a minute, because Boris has said today Russian attempts to interfere in our referendums and elections, whatever they might be, have not been successful. So he's implying, obviously, that they have been interfering.
Well, yes, and he's also saying that they've not been successful. Now, all there actually boils down to is that they seem to have some evidence that somebody in Russia, according to the IPS addresses, managed to put various tweets and posts up, some of which were in favour of this, of one candidate, and some of which were against another candidate. This is all the weaponisation of social media by the psychological warfare people running NATO, including the 1,000 people in Brigade 77, which is made up of British officers, all of whom are paid by the British taxpayer, to sit there online every day making stuff up, including making stuff up about the Russians interfering in elections. And as Johnson just rightly pointed out, it made no difference either way.
Well,
even if they did intervene, which of course they didn't.
Calm down. Sergei Lavrov has responded to Boris Johnson saying the absence of action can never result in anything. And he asked to see concrete facts about these alleged unsuccessful attempts to hack elections in Britain.
Well, exactly. In other words, the evidence is just not there, and what you've got is an awful lot of huffing and puffing, claiming that it's there when it's not. I put it to you people out there listening to this show. How much influence were you by the Russians in your vote on the referendum or in the last election? How much influence did you put on what the Russians wanted or didn't want?
But the whole thing here is that they're using social media and bots based in St. Petersburg to put ideas into people's head that they don't realise are coming from Russia.
They're suggesting that they're both in favour of Brexit, apart from the ones that are against Brexit, and in favour of Catalonia being independent, but also in favour. Now, the suggestion is that the Russians are playing both sides of the park, being in favour of independence for Catalonia, but also putting up stuff which is virulently against it because they're trying to stir the pot. The fact of the matter is the Russians have got better things to do with their time than messing around trying to fix elections by sitting there sending out bots. They've got a war in Syria. They've got a war in Ukraine. They've got the Third World War to prepare for. They are aware that there's going to be a war, possibly. That's what they're thinking about, not messing around with trying to pretend that they are fixing elections in the West with no influence over whatsoever.
Let's get back to US foreign policy and the statement by Trump we'll be hearing from in a minute. But this week at the United Nations there was a vote at the General Assembly on Jerusalem. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu denounced the United Nations as a house of lies amidst a large last-ditch effort by the US and Israel to head off the opposition. Has been accused of bullying, threatening to cut US funding on Wednesday as he gave his wholehearted support, Trump, to his UN ambassador Nikki Haley, who had sent members a letter warning that the US would be taking the names of anyone who opposed it.
Yes, and it's quite clear what the implication of that is. So they're going to cut off all military aid to Pakistan, are they?
Well, the draft resolution reaffirms...
On the basis that they won't support them.
The draft resolution
reaffirms
10 Security Council resolutions on Jerusalem, dating back to 1967, including requirements that the city's final status must be decided in direct negotiation between Israel and Palestine. It also demands that all states comply with Security Council resolutions regarding the holy city of Jerusalem and not to recognise any actions or measures contrary to those resolutions. Well, the end result of that was the repudiation by the General Assembly of Trump over the Jerusalem announcement. Trump suffered a humiliating defeat in the UN General Assembly on yesterday, as 128 countries condemned the President's December the 6th announcement recognising Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The 128-9 vote, with 35 abstentions, reflects the extreme isolation of the United States, according to the World Socialist website, and increases the prospect of a violent clash in the Middle East. The vote was preceded by this aggressive campaign of bullying and intimidation by Trump and other officials. Now, this doesn't really sound like mature diplomacy.
No, it's not. And I would suggest to you that it's not even very sensible, even from the point of view of the Israeli right wing, because what they need to do is basically carry on doing their nefarious stuff, but without drawing too much attention to themselves. But this is purely symbolic. It makes no difference to anything. If the Americans move their embassy to Jerusalem, it won't make any difference to anything.
What the United States is doing here is it's saying that all these countries are quite happy to take American protection around the world, the armed forces, to take American money, but when it comes to important resolutions about Jerusalem and about the sovereignty of Israel to decide what happens there, after all, it is part of their country, then they're actually betraying the United States.
Well, let's put it this way. The US provides a lot of support to Pakistan's military for its anti-terrorist operations and whatever. Now, Pakistan has just voted against them, so they could cut all that support off. But then the Chinese will step in and say, well, we'll take over. So that's what's going to happen. Cut off support to Pakistan, and the Chinese will then provide military support to Pakistan instead of the Americans. The Americans don't give money away for nothing. They give it away because they want something for it. Now, if they want to cut off their aid, military aid, to everybody except Israel, which is what they're talking about now, then it'll become absolutely clear what US foreign aid is for. It's to prop up the state of Israel, and that's all it does. Well, it doesn't do anything for anybody else.
In this country,
might as well cut it all off.
In this country, we have 6 or 7 major US bases, which are RAF bases, but they're actually US bases. And on Monday, at Mildenhall in Suffolk, someone drove through the entrance to that base and was potentially going to be killed, but there were shots fired. They drove through the entrance and managed to make it onto somewhere near the centre of the airfield, where they were then surrounded. They had apparently, according to the Daily Mail, a teddy bear strapped to their body, and so one does wonder whether this was some sort of anti-war protest. The person hasn't been released from custody yet, but anti-US protest. They have been classed as mentally ill, this person.
Well, I mean, they're lucky to be alive, frankly, doing a stunt like that. They're quite likely to be shot, weren't they? I mean, of course, there is a question: why are these bases here? I mean, we could just make friends with Russia, then we wouldn't need any bases, and when you could go home and you wouldn't have to spend the money at all, Donald. But you actually want us to spend 2% of our GDP on military spending, but we don't want to, because we don't want a war with Russia.
What do you make of Monday's incident? I mean, we don't know the details, but do you think this person is somebody who's just mentally ill?
It may be, or it doesn't sound like a professional hit, does it? It sounds like somebody who's, very much alone or doing something on their own. And we'll find out who this is and why and whatever later. But, of course, this is an issue all over the world for the US. This Jerusalem decision means that every embassy, every base, everywhere is going to have to be on full alert from now on, because possibly Palestine is going to declare war on the United States of America. That's the sort of thing Hamas is talking about, which means they are going to be legit targets. And it's not just them complaining, well, you can't declare war on us. no, you've just walked away from the peace process. You've just signed up with the Israelis. Maybe it's time for a war. You want a war with Syria. You want a war with Russia. You want a war with China. Maybe you should have your war. But that means that your bases all over the world are going to be targets, doesn't it?
What do you read into the news in the Times, the Daily Mail and elsewhere that the trespass Mildenhall suspect had a teddy bear strapped to his body? What sort of that message?
Well, we don't know what that means, but the problem with that is it's just hearsay, isn't it? In other words, it's an attempt. Presumably, the idea is that it looks like some kind of a suicide vest.
Well, it's not a suicide vest; it's a teddy bear.
All right. Well, yeah, in other words, Tony, we don't really know what's happened here. The person must be charged.
Because the person has not been allowed
they need to be charged or released, don't they? That's why we have habeas corpus in theory.
So, have they been charged or released? I'll see if I can find that out in a minute. But anyway, let's go to the Trump speech now. And here he is, just as a sort of introduction to his thoughts, Donald Trump, the US president, on the new foreign policy.
We are once again investing in our defense, almost $700 billion, a record this coming year. We are demanding extraordinary strength, which will hopefully lead to long and extraordinary peace. We are giving our courageous military men and women the support they need and so dearly deserve. We have withdrawn the United States from job-killing deals such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the very expensive and unfair Paris Climate Accord. And on our trip to Asia last month, I announced that we will no longer tolerate trading abuse. We have established strict new vetting procedures to keep terrorists out of the United States, and our vetting is getting tougher each month.
It's narcissistic, isn't it? It's all about us, all about us, all about us. The idea that they're spending loads and loads and loads on their military, but they're going to balance the books and they're going to get the deficit down and all the rest of it. It's just a farrago of nonsense, isn't it? And what gift the beastie gears to see ourselves as others see us, as Robbie Burns said. The Americans and Trump is a quintessential representative of this, are narcissistic. The only thing they think about is themselves and their own view of themselves. I mean, surely
his experience is in property development and running casinos.
Well, indeed, and that's what he thinks the world's like, which is why Nikki Haley's going around like Al Capone promising to break everybody's legs who don't vote for them. That's not the way you run diplomacy, and they've stuck two fingers up to them. All the people that they're supposedly... I mean, the only 9 countries that supported them are countries like Melanesia and so on, Marshall Islands, you know, because they're all completely dependent on the US. Everybody else voted against or abstained. That's total isolation. As you go into World War III, that's a very bad position to be in, I'd say.
To counter Iran and block its path to a nuclear weapon, I sanctioned the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps for its support of terrorism, and I declined to certify the Iran deal to Congress. Following my trip to the Middle East, the Gulf states and other Muslim-majority nations joined together to fight radical Islamist ideology and terrorist financing. We have dealt ISIS one devastating defeat after another. The coalition to defeat ISIS has now recaptured almost 100% of the land once held by these terrorists in Iraq and in Syria. Great job. Great job. Really good.
Well, that's absolutely ludicrous because, of course, the defeat of ISIS in Syria has been nothing to do with the Americans at all. And, of course, what the Russian General Staff and the Iranian General Staff believe, and the Iraqi General Staff believe, is that ISIS is, in fact, a cat's paw for the Americans. And so they claim that they're against ISIS. They claim that they defeated them, which is ludicrous. The RAF participated in the attack on the Syrian army at Deir ez-Zor, and it killed nearly 100 of their soldiers who were actually... And then ISIS took advantage of that to seize the position. That's the reality on the ground. Nobody in the Middle East believes this stuff. The fact of the matter is that the Americans are only talking to themselves. It's an internal...
No, that's not true, is it? Because the BBC believes this stuff. And much of the Western media across the board does.
At the same time, out there in the real world,
and most of the people in the Western world believe that.
Well, that may be so, but of course your opponents aren't going to accept that. And from a military point of view, people just laugh. I mean, the Russians are just laughing. The idea that you've defeated ISIS. They've discovered this week, it's come out that massive amounts of US military equipment have been found in the hands of ISIS. An independent NGO looking at this found out that they've got massive amounts of very highly sophisticated equipment directly from the US. I think it was only
25%, actually. Only 25%.
Of their
ammunition and guns and
this was the stuff that was
anti-tank
this was the stuff that was supplied to overthrow Assad 18 months ago, all in the hands of ISIS. And of course ISIS were allowed to escape from Raqqa, thousands of them, and then redeployed to Syria. And that's what the Russians and the Iranians see. And they hear Trump and they don't see... most people think that we're against ISIS. That's not what the rest of the world believes.
So you're saying that there's some sort of propaganda going on here in the West?
I think I am, Tony.
OK, well, we're going to hear from David Miller at Bath University. We'll hear a bit more about that in a minute, but more from Trump now.
We have a great military. We're now chasing them wherever they flee, and we will not let them into the United States. In Afghanistan, our troops are no longer undermined by artificial timelines, and we no longer tell our enemies of our plans. We are beginning to see results on the battlefield, and we have made clear to Pakistan that while we desire continued partnership, we must see decisive action against terrorist groups operating on their territory. And we make massive payments every year to Pakistan. They have to help. Our efforts to strengthen the NATO alliance set the stage for significant increases in member contributions, with tens of billions of dollars more pouring in, because I would not allow member states to be delinquent in the payment while we guarantee their safety and are willing to fight wars for them. We have made clear that countries that are immensely wealthy should reimburse the United States for the cost of defending them. This is a major departure from the past, but a fair and necessary one. Necessary for our country, necessary for our taxpayer, necessary for our own thought process.
So are they going to be asking Britain for billions of pounds or dollars to defend us?
They are. They're already asking for it. And of course the answer is quite simple. We don't want to be defended by you. It's time for NATO to go. It's time for your bases to go, and you can put all these people to work in the new industries that you're going to create by your fantastic economic policy in America.
If you don't pay the Americans, accidents can happen.
Well, exactly. And of course he's threatening there to cut off military aid to Pakistan. And if I was a Pakistani general, I'd say, OK, we'll get the money from China. You can whistle.
But it does sound a bit like a kind of protection racket he's running.
It is a protection racket.
But surely that's just been the case ever since the beginning of history. Actually, big powers, they are protection rackets.
Yeah, well, and don't forget the way the petrodollar system works is that the rest of the world has to hold their national debt in dollars, or the money they earn from selling their exports in dollars, so that they can pay their oil bills, which means that the rest of the world, fund the US military, and then the US military then insists that we pay up more for the US military so that the system can carry on. But the system's coming to an end. The Chinese and the Russians are setting up the gold-based yuan in Shanghai to buy oil with, and everybody's moving away from the United States. But they're very dangerous at this point because they're about to lose their number one position in the hierarchy. And at that point, that's when they're likely to have a war to prevent that from happening. And the war could be with North Korea, it could be with Iran, it could be with Lebanon and Syria, or it could happen somewhere else completely different. But we're in a very dangerous situation, and Trump represents a danger for humanity, frankly.
What about North Korea?
What about North Korea?
Well, do you think that there's any possibility of that flaring up? Because it does seem as if there's exercises going on and there's a lot of saber
what I've been hearing is that they are definitely thinking of a military option, which is absurd because there isn't a military option. They can strike North Korea. But if they do, then it will fire the starting gun on World War III. There will be immediate reaction. What the North Koreans will do will probably, what I would do if I was the North Koreans, is I would use a nuclear weapon to attack a military target in Japan, maybe the Okinawa base, which would kill loads of civilians, but he makes sure it looks like a military target. You're not just killing the maximum number of people, and that would kill all the US military.
But surely nobody wants World War III.
Oh, that wouldn't. Nobody wants World War III. Nobody wanted World War I. But if you've got idiots in charge like Trump, then they could easily stub their toe on it, couldn't they?
What about arms companies?
They want to sell arms. They don't necessarily want to have a World War III that would end humanity. But the problem is that the people in charge have locked themselves in now. I mean, for example, over North Korea, just for an example, because the Americans have threatened to go to war if X, Y and Z doesn't happen, and of course X, Y and Z is not going to happen, then they either look stupid because they don't go to war, or they have to go to war. But they back themselves into the corner with their own mouths there. If I was them, I wouldn't have said anything. And if you're going to carry out an attack on somebody, maybe you shouldn't mention it. If you're going to do it, you should just do it. And the fact of the matter is that they've been talking about it. They can't attack North Korea because they've got nuclear weapons. And of course, that means that we're a nuclear war. The North Koreans have made their position absolutely clear. You attack us, we are going to use those nuclear weapons. That's what we got them for.
Let's see what Trump had to say this week, anyway, about North Korea.
Our campaign of maximum pressure on the North Korean regime has resulted in the toughest ever sanctions. We have united our allies in an unprecedented effort to isolate North Korea. However, there is much more work to do. America and its allies will take all necessary steps to achieve a denuclearization and ensure that this regime cannot threaten the world. This situation should have been taken care of long before I got into office, when it was much easier to handle. But it will be taken care of. We have no choice.
Well, I mean, as I just said, you've locked yourself in there. Instead of saying, you've made it, you've got to solve this now through warfare. I mean, let's be clear, they're saying they're going to go to war with North Korea. There isn't actually a military option with North Korea that doesn't involve the deaths of millions of people. So in actual fact,
when Trump
it's a stupid thing to say.
When Trump talks about denuclearization of North Korea, what does he actually mean?
It doesn't mean anything unless
it does. So
the North Koreans are not going to unilaterally give up their nuclear weapons. They'd be fools if they did. They've developed them precisely because of the attacks on Iraq and on Libya, on Syria, etc. They don't trust the word of the United States. There was actually a deal that Clinton did where they were prepared to give up their nuclear program on the basis of some kind of reciprocity from the other side. George W. Bush shot that out of the water. So of course at that point they start to take steps to defend themselves. Why have Britain got nuclear weapons? Because we don't want to run the risk of somebody attacking us with nuclear weapons. And the North Koreans have got much more reason to believe that they're going to be attacked. Therefore, they've got nuclear weapons just as we have.
What about the possibility of missing nuclear weapons or rogue nuclear weapons being used and then potentially as a false flag and being blamed on someone else?
All right, well, let's see if there was a false flag the North Koreans supposedly carried out a nuclear attack. Now, whether the North Koreans did or didn't carry out the nuclear attack, they've still got nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapon states cannot be bullied. The Israelis can't be bullied because they've got hundreds of nuclear warheads. Totally illegally,
you can't just buy a nuclear weapon on the black market, surely.
Well, maybe you can and maybe you can't. It doesn't really matter. Once somebody's got them, wherever they got them from, the military problem you face is that Japan... if I was the North Koreans, I wouldn't attack South Korea. I would attack Japan, and I would attack a military target in Japan. The base in Okinawa, which the Japanese hate anyway and don't really want there, would be a perfectly good target. And that would kill everybody in that base and lots of other people. And that would just be for starters, because then the war will really start. Both the Russian and Chinese militaries are all gearing up here. And of course, what this is really about, as we said earlier, it's about China. North Korea is a minor irritant.
Isn't this just a way out of an economic crisis? Because it's a way of distracting attention from the fact that they've completely failed to manage the economy.
Well, I mean,
the
point is that the economy of Britain and the United States is totally dependent on arms production. We don't do anything else anymore.
I thought it was dependent on housing.
Well, yes, property speculation and arms production. So we are not like the Germans who actually export machine tools. That's not what we do.
OK, well, let's have a listen to Trump's parting gesture, kind of conclusion to his speech earlier this week.
Every American has a role to play in this grand national effort. And today I invite every citizen to take their part in our vital mission. Together, our task is to strengthen our families, to build up our communities, to serve our citizens, and to celebrate American greatness as a shining example to the world. As long as we are proud, and very proud of who we are, how we got here, and what we are fighting for to preserve, we will not fail. If we do all of this, if we rediscover our resolve and commit ourselves to compete and win again, then together we will leave our children and our grandchildren a nation that is stronger, better, freer, prouder, and yes, an America that is greater than ever before. God bless you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, well, being great and greater than everybody else is a bit of an ask, isn't it? Not just the same as everybody else and part of the team, just greater than everybody else. That's hubris, and from hubris comes nemesis.
Explain yourself.
Well, this is Greek tragedy. Hubris is where you have an attitude that you are better than you think. You think you're better than you actually are. You're not realistic about your place in the world. I mean, what America has to do, like Britain did after World War II, is adjust to not being an empire. That's pretty hard to do when you've got people like Trump in charge who want to have an empire, and he's not the only one.
Is it possible to do?
Britain did a pretty good job in a messy sort of way.
For the US at the moment.
Well, that's ultimately where they've got to go if there's any hope for humanity. The attempt to preserve American dominance will lead ultimately to world war. They need to get off their high horse and start talking to other people that they need to be talking to.
Well, the track record since the Second World War is not too fantastic.
No, it's not, is it?
Let's have a listen now to a US writer, William Bloom, and his book is America's Deadliest Export, Democracy, where he talks about the number of individuals and number of countries the US is trying to take over.
Socialism is the main enemy of American corporations here and overseas, and they need a government in place which is going to be sympathetic to free enterprise in its full glory. And so we have attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders since the end of the Second World War. That's more than 50 leaders. We have attempted to overthrow more than 50 countries in the same time period. We actually bombed more than 30 countries since 1945 and so on. I've compiled it all. I was amazed myself how much there was. When I began, I had no idea there was this much to uncover. But we have to keep doing this to keep from power any government which is not going to be sympathetic to the aims of the multinational corporations. And that's why we hate the Cubans so much. The Cubans have never apologized for throwing out capitalism, and they have infected the entire Latin America with their philosophy. That can't be excused. That's why Cuba is a perpetual enemy and an object of hatred, and it'll be the way forever.
That's William Bloom there, the author of the book is America's Deadliest Export, Democracy.
Yeah, well, it's not just democracy, of course. They've crushed democracy in many countries and exported dictatorship.
Well, we heard there the figures. 50 plus attempts to overthrow national governments, 50 plus attempts to assassinate leaders, 30 plus countries bombed.
Yeah, well, I mean, the polite way of saying it is that the US wants to be the world's policeman, but they're not the world's policeman, they're the world's gangster. But just like the Nazi regime in the 40s, they are now making themselves completely isolated. Ultimately, they're going to find, if they go to World War III, and I'm afraid they may well get there, is that they're not nobody's going to win, but they're definitely not going to win, because the things are moving against them. This boost in the stock market in the US is all based on fantasy. and in actual fact, the economy is incredibly weak, and they're going to lose World War III. And the question is, they need to lose it, but lose it in such a way that we all survive it. And they need to think in terms of changing their attitude towards the rest of the world. The narcissism in the US is unbelievable, and Trump.
But it's not surely that amongst ordinary people mostly.
No, the ordinary people are ill-informed. And of course, the electoral system in the US and the political system isn't a democracy; it's an oligarchy. And of course, oligarchies can be stable or unstable. It's an unstable oligarchy with revanchist ambitions.
It almost seems like there's a whole, almost an industry behind informing people.
Well, indeed, it's part of the psychological warfare game that they play. They're accusing the Russians of fixing elections and trying to bend people's minds. That's because they spend millions on doing exactly that. Doesn't always work, but they spend an awful lot of money on it, and therefore they claim that other people are doing what they are doing, which is to try and bend people's perceptions.
OK, so let's have a listen now to Bath University sociology professor David Miller talking about propaganda, which is actually what we're talking about here, in mind-bending and dumbing down people's consciousness. So what's David got to say about it?
The term propaganda comes from the Vatican's Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. It's about propagating the faith in the sense of getting people to join the church, to become believers in the church. So propagation in the same sense as propagating plants. So you grow something. So the original sense has a sense of organic changes in society. Since then, when propaganda was adopted as a term for the kinds of communications that happen, especially in wartime, propaganda has become a term which mainly relates to communication, to posters or political speeches or communication through the media. And one of the things that we think about propaganda, it's important to go back to the original sense. When people talked in the 1800s about organising a propaganda, they meant a body of people to change society. It's about trying to organise conduct as opposed to just change minds. So you hear the phrase hearts and minds quite often in relation to propaganda or other similar terms. And yes, it's about minds, and yes, it's about hearts, but it's also about organising behaviour in the world in the interests of those who are the propagandists.
Propaganda is organised persuasive communication which has become, on some level, manipulative. That it's not about persuading people, getting people to agree with you, it's actually about manipulating people. So propaganda then becomes defined as attempts to deceive or incentivize or to coerce people to get them to think things that they wouldn't otherwise think. It's a non-consensual process.
The term propaganda came to be used for communication in wartime, especially in the First World War. And it got a bad name in the 1914-18 war, especially with atrocity stories about the Hun, i.e. the Germans, which helped to bring the British and the Americans into the First World War. And as a result, there were many people who saw the power of propaganda to change minds and to organise conduct. They decided that propaganda was too controversial a term and that they had to find another term. The father of this activity, Edward Bernays, came up with a new term, and that was public relations. And so public relations became a term for propaganda, which started to replace propaganda from the 1920s onwards, but especially after the Second World War. But of course the problem with that is that when people start to understand public relations, they start to become sceptical of that. So there's a constant attempt to change what we call propaganda because it gets a bad reputation. The terms become soiled, and so there's been a whole succession of different terms: psychological operations, psychological war, strategic communication, information warfare, marketing and advertising are new terms as well, which are essentially all refer to the potential to propagate ideas and behaviour in society. One way in which you are in non-consensual communication is through the use of deception, because people are not making informed decisions because they've been lied to. But another way in which there's non-consensual communication is through the question of coercion. And I want to give you a very clear example of that. When Western states are engaged in invasions and military operations, such as, for example, the invasion of Iraq in 1990-91 and again in 2003, the US and the UK, they drop leaflets on those countries for the local people. In the leaflets they say, we will bomb this area soon. Either you will be a target of that bombing if you don't remove yourself from here, or if you leave here, we will spare you.
I'm not quite sure what the Christmas music was in the background there. I think that was just part of the recording. But that was Professor David Miller, sociology professor from Bath University. And you also heard a brief clip there with Piers Morrison, who's a Manchester professor. But he really, I think, sums it up quite well there, Martin. Interesting also that the roots are in religion, because this is all about what people believe.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting that the meaning of words is very useful in terms of trying to understand how they're used. And propaganda was originally the propagation of the Catholic faith. And, of course, it's then come generally to mean the means by which you communicate, a political message to get people to do what you want them to do. And when it was used in the First World War, the term propaganda didn't have the connotations that it has now got of something sinister. It was regarded as, our attempt to get our side of the story across. And I think what we've got to develop is a critical media and users of media all over the world, that we're prepared to listen to any point of view, but we are going to disentangle what that point of view means. We're going to interrogate it. We're going to listen to different stories before we make up our minds.
But journalism is supposed to be about taking different points of view and including them in the story, because if it's only one point of view, it's not journalism.
Well, indeed, but at the same time, you've got to recognise that the Daily Mail has an agenda. Should it be banned? I think not.
But what about this?
You've got to recognise that it is propaganda.
This programme, do we have an agenda?
Well, to some extent, some people might say we do. But the point is that we have a much broader breadth of opinion on here than would be normal in a Tory tabloid, for example. And of course, what actually happens is people think that they've heard all the opinions because they've watched the mainstream TV and picked up a newspaper. And in actual fact, they've only heard a tiny fraction of the possible opinions that they might be exposed to. And then most of the time, they're blissfully unaware of all the other things that they need to know.
Here, beautifully bringing in our next topic, which is 1995 and 1996 in Israel, with the biggest ever peace rally, 100,000 Israelis in Jerusalem.